The wagon lurched to a halt outside Arcadia's trading post, its wheels caked with the red mud of spring runoff. Elena Vasquez pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she climbed down, her legs unsteady after 3 days of bone-jarring travel. The baby in her arms stirred but didn't wake, his fever-flushed cheeks the reason she'd made this desperate journey north from the borderlands. "This is far as I go, senora," the freight driver called down, already unlashing her few belongings from the wagon bed. "Road to Santa Fe, don't wait for nobody." Elena nodded, pressing a silver coin into his weathered palm. Her last silver coin. The driver touched his hat brim and clucked to his mules, leaving her standing in the muddy street with a sick child, a canvas satchel of herbs, and nowhere to go. Arcadia wasn't much to look at in the harsh April light. A single row of buildings hugged one side of the rutted main street. The trading post, a saloon with a crooked sign, what looked like a general store, and a small church with a bell tower that needed paint. Across the way, a handful of houses squatted behind picket fences, their windows watching her with the suspicious stare of small-town folks sizing up a stranger. The trading post door banged open, and a man stepped onto the wooden walkway. Tall and lean, with sandy hair and pale eyes that took her measure from head to toe. He wore the kind of clean clothes that marked him as someone with position in this place. A silver star pinned to his vest confirmed it. "Sheriff Carson?" Elena asked, shifting the baby to her other arm. "I was told in Las Cruces that you might." "Might what?" His voice carried the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed. "This is a peaceful town, ma'am. We don't need whatever trouble you're bringing up from the territories." "No trouble, Sheriff. Just—" She looked down at the baby, whose breathing had grown more labored during the journey. "My son is very sick. I heard there was a doctor here, or someone who could help." Carson's expression didn't soften. "Doc Henley died 2 months back. Pneumonia took him." His gaze flicked to her dark hair, her brown skin, the unfamiliar cut of her dress. "Nearest real doctors in Santa Fe. You'd best catch the next wagon through. I have no money for passage." The words came out harder than she'd intended. "And he cannot travel much longer without treatment." "Then you should have thought of that before you came north." Carson stepped back toward the trading post door. "Jim Hartley runs this establishment. He could give you directions to the mission at San Miguel. That's where your kind usually—" "Sheriff." The voice came from the church, and Elena turned to see a woman approaching. Gray-haired and sturdy-built, she moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. "What seems to be the trouble here?" "No trouble, Mrs. Parker. Just giving this woman directions to move along." The woman Elena assumed was a preacher's wife came closer, her eyes immediately drawn to the baby. "That child looks poorly. How long has he been fevered?" 5 days, Elena answered, grateful for even this small kindness. "It started as a cough, but now—" She pulled back the blanket to show the baby's flushed face, the rapid flutter of his breathing. Mrs. Parker's expression sharpened. "That's not just fever. Look at his breathing, Sheriff. And those spots along his neck." Carson frowned, but stepped closer. Elena saw his face change as he got his first clear look at the child. The baby's skin bore the telltale rash she'd been praying would fade, and his breath came in quick, shallow pants. "What is it?" Carson demanded. "I don't rightly know," Mrs. Parker admitted. "But it's nothing I've seen before. And if it's catching—" "It's not catching," Elena said quickly, though her heart hammered with the lie. She couldn't be certain, but she'd seen similar symptoms in children back home, a sickness that sometimes spread through families like wildfire. "Please, I know treatments that might help him. Traditional remedies from my grandmother. I just need a place to prepare them, somewhere warm and clean." Carson shook his head. "I don't care what your grandmother knew about root medicine. We're not taking chances with some foreign sickness in this town." He gestured toward the road. "There's an abandoned soddy about 5 miles west. You can make camp there until you figure out how to move on." "Sheriff Carson." Mrs. Parker's voice carried a note of reproach. That soddy doesn't even have a roof. And this woman has a sick baby. My concern is for the people of this town, Martha. Not for strangers who bring trouble with them. Elena felt anger flare in her chest, hot and familiar. It was the same tone, the same dismissive certainty she'd heard from Anglo officials and lawmen all her life. The tone that said her people didn't belong, didn't matter, couldn't be trusted. I am not bringing trouble, she said, meeting Carson's stare directly. I am a healer. I have helped many children with this sickness before. But my son needs treatment now, and I need herbs that grow here, not in the desert. Healer. Carson's mouth twisted with skepticism. What kind of healing? Witch doctoring? Pagan ceremonies? Medicine, Elena replied evenly. The kind that saves lives when doctors are not available. A small crowd had begun to gather. The trading post door opened wider, and Jim Hartley emerged with two other men Elena didn't recognize. From the general store, a woman in an apron stepped onto the walkway, watching with undisguised curiosity. Even the saloon had emptied a bit, its patrons clustering near the batwing doors. What's the commotion, Sheriff? Hartley called out. Mexican woman wants to practice her folk magic on her sick child, Carson answered, raising his voice slightly. I'm directing her to move along before whatever disease that baby's carrying spreads to our families. It's not a disease, Elena protested, but she could see the fear already spreading across the faces around her. Fear of the unknown, of her foreign appearance, of sickness they didn't understand. Ma'am, said one of the men by the trading post, begging your pardon, but if that child's got something catching, maybe it's best if you do move along. We got children of our own to think about. Elena looked around the circle of wary faces and felt the familiar weight of being outnumbered, unwelcome, judged before she could prove herself. But the baby in her arms gave a soft whimper, and she felt his temperature rising even through the blanket. He wouldn't survive another day of travel, much less the journey to Santa Fe. I will make you a bargain, she said, addressing Carson directly but speaking loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Give me 1 day. Let me treat my son with the medicines I know. If he shows no improvement by tomorrow evening, I will leave. But if the treatments help him. She paused, meeting the sheriff's pale eyes. Then perhaps you will admit that my healing knowledge has value. And if more people get sick? Carson shot back. What then? Then you will have lost nothing by trying to save one child's life. The crowd stirred at this, murmurs passing between neighbors. Elena caught fragments. Just one night. Poor little thing. What if it were our baby? Mrs. Parker stepped forward. Sheriff, the parsonage has a small room we use for storing supplies. It's separate from the main house, with its own entrance. The woman could stay there with her child, away from the rest of us, until we see how he fares. Carson's jaw worked as he considered this. Elena could see the calculation in his eyes, the political cost of appearing heartless versus the risk of appearing weak. She pressed her advantage. I ask for nothing but a place to prepare my medicines and tend my child. No food from your stores, no charity from your people. Just one chance to prove that healing knowledge comes in many forms. And if the baby dies? Carson asked bluntly. Elena's arms tightened around her son. Then I will bury him and move on, as you wish. But I will not let him die without trying everything I know to save him. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the baby's labored breathing and the distant sound of hammering from somewhere behind the buildings. Elena waited, holding Carson's gaze, refusing to look away or show the desperation clawing at her chest. Finally, Carson nodded curtly. 1 day, he said. But I'll be watching. Any sign that this sickness is spreading, any hint of unnatural proceedings, and you're gone. Understood. Understood. Mrs. Parker touched Elena's elbow gently. Come along then, dear. Let's get you and the baby settled. As they walked toward the church, Elena caught Carson's final words to the crowd. Everyone keep your distance. And if any of your children start showing signs of fever or rash, you bring them to me immediately. The parsonage was a modest white-painted house behind the church, and the room Mrs. Parker showed her was indeed small, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a wooden chair. But it had a window facing east to catch the morning sun, and more importantly, it had a small iron stove with a kettle. "There's firewood stacked outside," Mrs. Parker said, smoothing the quilt on the bed. "And I'll bring you some water from the well. Will that do for your treatments?" "It will do very well. Thank you." Elena laid the baby on the bed, noting how his breathing had grown even more shallow. "Mrs. Parker, may I ask, are there willows growing near the stream that runs behind the town? And perhaps elderberry bushes on the hillside?" The older woman nodded slowly. "There are indeed. Though I can't imagine what you'd want with them. Willow bark contains medicine for fever and pain. Elderberry helps the body fight infection." Elena was already unpacking her satchel, laying out small bundles of dried herbs alongside a few precious glass vials. "These plants grow here because the earth knows what healing the people need. My grandmother taught me to read the land's wisdom." Mrs. Parker watched with obvious fascination as Elena arranged her supplies. "Your grandmother was a healer too?" "A curandera, yes. She learned from her grandmother, and she from hers, back to the time when all healing was done with plants and prayer." Elena held up a small bundle of dried leaves. "This is manzanilla, what you call chamomile. Good for calming sick children. And this." She touched another bundle reverently. "Osha root, from the high mountains. Very powerful for lung sickness." "I've never heard of osha root. It does not grow in this country. I brought it from the mountains near my village." Elena looked up at Mrs. Parker. "Every place has its own healing plants. The wise healer learns to use what the land provides, but sometimes the old medicines from far away are needed too." Mrs. Parker was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'll fetch that water. And perhaps you could show me how you prepare these medicines? I've always had an interest in healing herbs, though I never learned proper. I would be honored to share what I know." After Mrs. Parker left, Elena began her work in earnest. She started water boiling in the kettle, then carefully measured dried willow bark into a small pot. While it steeped, she ground osha root between two smooth stones, releasing its pungent medicinal scent into the small room. The baby stirred on the bed, his whimpers growing stronger. Elena picked him up, noting the heat radiating from his small body. His name was Miguel, after the patron saint of healing, and she had carried him 300 miles through desert and mountain to reach this unwelcoming place. She would not lose him now. "Mijo," she whispered, holding him against her chest. "Hold on a little longer. The medicines are coming." Through the window, she could see people passing on the main street, most of them slowing to peer toward the parsonage. Word would be spreading quickly. The Mexican woman with her foreign healing ways, the sick child who might carry death in his fever. She had faced such suspicion before, but never with so much at stake. The willow bark tea was ready first. Elena strained it carefully, then added a small amount of honey from her dwindling supplies. She dipped a cloth in the warm liquid and placed it on Miguel's lips, letting a few drops trickle into his mouth. He swallowed reflexively, and she continued the process patiently, one drop at a time. Next came the osha preparation. She mixed the ground root with hot water, creating a potent tea that smelled like mountain forests and ancient wisdom. This she would use for steam treatment, holding the baby over the fragrant vapor to help clear his struggling lungs. As she worked, Elena found herself thinking about her grandmother's teachings. "The plants will speak to you," the old woman had said, "but only if you listen with your heart as well as your hands. And remember, Mija, healing is not just about the body. Sometimes the greatest sickness is in the spirit, in the fear and hatred that people carry. A true curandera heals not just the patient, but the community that surrounds them." Elena had been too young then to understand the full meaning of those words. Now, listening to the murmur of worried voices from the street, She was beginning to grasp what her grandmother had tried to teach her. Healing Miguel was only part of the challenge she faced. The greater test would be proving to these frightened, suspicious people that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. Mrs. Parker returned with a bucket of fresh water and lingered to watch as Elena prepared the steam treatment. "That smell," she said wonderingly. "It's quite strong, but somehow comforting." "The OSHA is working," Elena explained, holding Miguel so his face was positioned over the rising steam. "Breathe, Mijo. Let the plant spirits help you." The baby's breathing did seem to ease slightly as the medicinal vapors reached his lungs. Mrs. Parker noticed too. "Why, I do believe it's helping already." "The fever will take longer to break," Elena cautioned. "But yes, the OSHA is opening his airways." She looked up at the older woman. "Mrs. Parker, may I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." "Sheriff Carson, has he always been so unwelcoming to strangers?" Mrs. Parker's expression grew complicated. "Thomas Carson is a good man at heart," she said slowly. "But he's seen trouble come to frontier towns before. Raiders, disease, claim jumpers who bring violence with them. He believes his first duty is to protect the people who've built their lives here. And people like me, we are trouble by our very existence?" "That's not what I meant." "It is what he means, though." Elena adjusted Miguel's position, letting more of the healing steam reach his face. "I have lived with such judgment my whole life, Mrs. Parker. The fear that strangers bring only danger, never gifts." Mrs. Parker was quiet for a long moment. Finally she said, "What gifts do you bring, Elena? Besides your healing knowledge?" It was the first time anyone in Arcadia had used her name, and Elena felt a small warmth kindle in her chest. "I bring the knowledge of how to survive in hard places," she said. "How to find food and medicine where others see only wasteland. How to read weather signs and animal tracks. How to make clothing and shelter from what the land provides." She smiled slightly. "And how to make the best tamales north of the Rio Grande, though I suspect that skill would not impress Sheriff Carson." Mrs. Parker laughed despite herself. "You might be surprised. We've had nothing but hardtack and salt pork for weeks now. Fresh supplies don't come through until late summer. Then you are missing much good food that grows wild all around you. The young shoots of prickly pear, for instance, or lamb's quarters, or the roots of wild onions." Elena checked Miguel's temperature with her hand. "Still too hot, but perhaps not quite as burning as before. My people have lived in harsh country for many generations. We learned to find abundance where others see only hardship." "Thomas Carson sees hardship everywhere," Mrs. Parker said quietly. "Perhaps that's why he finds it so hard to see abundance." Elena looked up sharply. There was something in the older woman's tone, a sadness that suggested personal knowledge. "You know him well?" "I've known Thomas since he was a boy. He came here 15 years ago, after—" Mrs. Parker hesitated. "After losing his wife and daughter to cholera back in Missouri. He was running from grief, I think, trying to find a place where death couldn't follow him." Elena felt a pang of unexpected sympathy. "Ah," she said softly. "So he sees sickness and thinks of his lost family." "I believe so, yes. It doesn't excuse his behavior toward you, but it might explain it." Miguel stirred in Elena's arms and made a soft sound, not the weak whimper she'd been hearing, but something stronger. She looked down and saw his eyes flutter open, focusing on her face for the first time in 2 days. "Mama," he whispered. Elena's heart nearly burst with relief. "See, Mijo, I am here. How do you feel? Thirsty?" Mrs. Parker hurried to pour water from the bucket into a cup. Elena helped Miguel drink slowly, noting that his fever, while still present, had definitely begun to break. The OSHA steam had cleared his breathing significantly, and the willow bark was working on the inflammation. "He's better," Mrs. Parker breathed. "Already, he's better." Elena nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Miguel was far from recovered, but for the first time since his illness began, she dared to hope he might survive. Outside, footsteps approached the small room. Elena tensed, but it was only Reverend Parker, Mrs. Parker's husband, arriving home from whatever duties had kept him away during the afternoon. "Martha," he called. "I heard we have visitors." Mrs. Parker went to the door. "Come meet Elena, dear. She's the healer I told you about." Reverend Parker was a thin, kindly-looking man with graying hair and gentle eyes. He nodded politely to Elena, then looked at Miguel with obvious concern. "The child seems much improved," he observed. "The fever is breaking," Elena confirmed. "Tomorrow he should be strong enough to take more substantial medicine." "Praise God for that." The Reverend's voice held genuine relief. "Martha tells me you've come a long way to seek help for your son." "From the Mesilla Valley, yes. 3 days of hard travel." "And you're a healer yourself?" Elena nodded. "My grandmother trained me in the old ways. Plant medicine, mostly, though I know some other treatments." Reverend Parker sat down in the wooden chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know, we've been without a doctor since February. The town council has been discussing how to attract a new physician to Arcadia, but it's difficult. Not many trained doctors want to practice in a frontier settlement." "I am not a trained doctor," Elena said carefully. "I have no papers, no certificate from a medical college." "But you have knowledge," Mrs. Parker interjected. "Real knowledge that saves lives." "Knowledge that some would call superstition," Elena replied. "Or worse." Reverend Parker leaned forward. "May I ask, what do you believe about healing? What guides your practice?" Elena considered the question seriously. It was the kind of inquiry that could mark her as either ally or enemy, depending on how she answered. "I believe that the Creator put healing power into the earth itself," she said finally. "Into plants and stones and water, into the movements of sun and moon, into the wisdom that passes between generations. My role is not to create healing, but to recognize it where it already exists and help it reach those who need it." The Reverend nodded slowly. "That sounds quite biblical to me." "And God said, Behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed. To you it shall be for meat." Genesis, chapter 1. Elena felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Your God and mine are perhaps not so different then." "Perhaps not." Reverend Parker glanced at his wife, then back to Elena. "Would you be willing to share some of your knowledge with our community? Not as a replacement for a proper physician, but as additional wisdom. If people would listen to such wisdom coming from someone like me." Mrs. Parker touched her husband's arm. "Thomas Carson might take some convincing." "Thomas Carson is not the only voice in this town," the Reverend replied firmly. "And if this child continues to recover, I suspect even Thomas will have to admit that there's value in what you know." Elena looked down at Miguel, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in days. His breathing was steady, his fever clearly diminishing. The crisis was not over. He would need careful tending for several more days, but the worst danger had passed. "I would be honored to share what I can," she said. "Though I warn you, some of my methods might seem strange to people accustomed to different approaches." "Strange how?" Reverend Parker asked with genuine curiosity. Elena hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I sing while I prepare medicines, old songs that my grandmother taught me. I believe the intention and spirit put into the healing is as important as the plants themselves. And sometimes—" She looked up to gauge their reactions. "Sometimes I see things, dreams or visions that guide me to the right treatment, or warn me of dangers to come." She waited for the usual response. The careful withdrawal, the polite but firm dismissal, the fear of anything that couldn't be explained by rational thought. Instead, she saw only interest in both faces. "The gift of healing often comes with other gifts," Reverend Parker said quietly. "The scriptures speak of such things. Prophecy, discernment, wisdom that transcends ordinary understanding. You are not concerned about witchcraft?" Elena asked. "I'm concerned about healing," Mrs. Parker replied. "And from what I've seen this afternoon, you have more skill in that area than anyone in this town." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the small room with golden light. Elena realized she had made it through her first day in Arcadia, and Miguel was not only alive but recovering. It was more than she had dared hope for when she climbed down from the freight wagon that morning. But tomorrow would bring new challenges. Sheriff Carson would be watching for any sign that she had failed to keep her promise. The townspeople would be looking for proof that her methods were either miraculous or dangerous. And she would need to gather fresh plants from the local countryside, which meant venturing beyond the relative safety of the parsonage. "Mrs. Parker," she said, "could you tell me where I might find the willow trees I mentioned earlier? I will need fresh bark tomorrow to continue Miguel's treatment." "Of course. They grow along Cottonwood Creek, about a quarter-mile behind the church. But, dear—" Mrs. Parker's expression grew concerned. "You shouldn't go alone. Some of the townspeople are still quite nervous about your presence." "I'll go with her," Reverend Parker offered. "I often walk along the creek for my morning prayers. We can gather what's needed without drawing too much attention." Elena felt a rush of gratitude toward these two kind people who had shown her more acceptance in one afternoon than she'd received from most Anglo communities in her entire life. "Thank you," she said simply. "Both of you. You have been more generous than I had any right to expect." "Nonsense," Mrs. Parker replied briskly. "You're a mother with a sick child. That's all the right you need." As the Parkers prepared to leave her for the night, Elena settled back to continue her vigil over Miguel. The OSHA treatment would need to be repeated every few hours, and she had other preparations to make: a poultice for his chest, a tea from elderberries to boost his body's defenses, a gentle salve for the rash that still marked his neck and arms. But for the first time since his illness began, she worked with hope instead of desperation. And as she sang the old healing songs under her breath, the ones her grandmother had taught her, passed down through countless generations of curanderas, Elena began to believe that she might have found something she hadn't even known she was looking for, a place where her knowledge was valued, where her gifts might grow into something larger than just survival. Tomorrow would test that hope. Tomorrow, Sheriff Carson would return, and the town would watch to see whether the Mexican woman's promises proved true or false. But tonight, with Miguel's fever breaking and the sound of gentle voices still warming the small room, Elena allowed herself to believe that healing, real healing, might be possible in Arcadia after all. By June, Miguel was running barefoot through the dusty streets of Arcadia, his laughter carrying on the warm wind that swept down from the surrounding hills. Elena watched him from the parsonage garden where she tended the medicinal plants she'd established in neat rows behind the small building. What had begun as a temporary arrangement had stretched into 2 months of cautious acceptance, with the Parkers insisting she stay until the boy was fully recovered. The truth was, Miguel had been strong enough to travel for weeks now. But Elena found herself reluctant to leave this place where her knowledge had taken root as surely as the herbs she cultivated. Word of Miguel's recovery had spread through the territory, bringing a steady trickle of visitors seeking remedies for ailments that conventional medicine couldn't touch. A rancher's wife with consumption had traveled from Silver City. A miner with lung fever had come down from the hills. A family whose youngest daughter suffered seizures had ridden 3 days from Mesilla. Elena treated them all, always with the Parkers' blessing and always with Sheriff Carson's watchful disapproval. "You're encouraging them," Carson said on this particular morning, approaching the garden where Elena was harvesting chamomile. "Word spreading that Arcadia has some kind of miracle worker. You're turning this town into a destination for every desperate soul and charlatan in the territory." Elena straightened, wiping her hands on the canvas apron Mrs. Parker had sewn for her. "I turn no one away who needs help," she replied evenly. "Is that not what your Christian teachings recommend?" "My Christian teachings also warn against false prophets and dangerous deceptions." "Which am I, Sheriff? A false prophet or a dangerous deceiver?" Carson's jaw worked as he struggled with an answer. In the 2 months since her arrival, Elena had successfully treated more than a dozen patients, including several of Arcadia's own residents. Old Henrik Carlson's arthritis had improved dramatically after Elena prepared a salve from local willow and wild mint. Sarah Hartley's difficult pregnancy had stabilized after treatment with red raspberry leaf tea and gentle massage. Even young Bobby Mills, who'd been suffering mysterious stomach ailments for months, had recovered completely after Elena identified his problem as simple worm infestation and provided the appropriate herbal remedies. Each success made it harder for Carson to dismiss her as a fraud, but also seemed to deepen his resentment. "I'm saying you're practicing medicine without proper training or certification," he said finally. "That's against territorial law." "Is it?" Elena continued her harvesting, her movements deliberately calm. "I was not aware that the territory had passed laws against helping sick children or making tea from common plants." "You know what I mean." "I know what you fear," Elena replied, looking up to meet his pale eyes directly. "You fear that accepting my help means admitting you were wrong about me, that a Mexican woman might possess knowledge you lack." Carson's face flushed red. "This has nothing to do with what you are. It's about what you're doing. You're encouraging people to trust in superstition instead of seeking real medical help. The nearest real medical help, as you call it, is 3 days' ride away. Should sick children wait 3 days for treatment that might not come at all?" Before Carson could answer, a commotion erupted from the main street. Shouting voices, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, and underlying it all, a sound that made Elena's blood run cold, the desperate wailing of a mother whose child was in mortal danger. Both Elena and Carson turned toward the sound. A wagon was racing into town at dangerous speed, its driver lashing the horses mercilessly while a woman in the wagon bed screamed for help. Even at a distance, Elena could see small figures lying motionless in the wagon's depths. "Dear God," Carson breathed, his antagonism forgotten in the face of obvious crisis. Elena was already running toward the main street, her healer's instincts overriding everything else. The wagon pulled up in front of the trading post in a cloud of dust, and Elena reached it just as the driver, a weather-beaten rancher she didn't recognize, jumped down from the seat. "Help us!" the woman in the wagon cried. It was Mary Brennan from the Triple B Ranch, Elena realized, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Please, someone help us. The children are dying." Elena climbed into the wagon bed and felt her heart sink. 3 children lay there, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. All were unconscious, their breathing shallow and labored. Their skin had a grayish pallor, and foam flecked their lips. But most troubling of all was the smell, a sweet, sickly odor that Elena recognized with dawning horror. "How long have they been like this?" she asked urgently, checking the pulse of the nearest child. "Since this morning," Mary sobbed. "They were fine at breakfast, but then Jimmy started vomiting, and Sarah collapsed, and little Tom just fell over and wouldn't wake up." Elena's mind raced. The symptoms, the rapid onset, the sweet smell. She had seen this before, in a mining camp near Las Cruces where children had been poisoned by contaminated water. But this was different. Worse. What did they eat this morning? Elena demanded. "What did they drink?" "Same as always," Mary replied. "Biscuits and jam, milk from our own cows." "The jam," Elena interrupted. "What kind of jam?" "Elderberry. I made it myself last fall from berries the children picked." Mary's voice grew defensive. "I've made elderberry jam 100 times. There's nothing wrong with. Where did they pick the berries?" Elena was already climbing out of the wagon, her healer's bag in hand. "Exactly where?" "Up in the canyon behind our place. There's a grove of elderberry bushes near the old mine shaft." Elena's worst fears crystallized. "Sheriff Carson," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood the full scope of the crisis. "I need every person in this town gathered immediately. Right now." Carson, who had been staring at the unconscious children with growing alarm, turned to her with confusion. "What are you talking about?" "These children have been poisoned by pokeweed berries mixed with elderberries. The symptoms match exactly: rapid onset, respiratory depression, that sweet smell." Elena was already pulling supplies from her bag. But more importantly, if Mrs. Brennan made jam from these berries, and if any of that jam has been shared with other families. The implications hit Carson like a physical blow. His face went white. How many families? I don't know, Elena replied grimly. But in a community like this, with harvest season approaching and everyone sharing preserves. She looked up at the growing crowd of townspeople. We may be looking at a dozen families or more. And children are the most vulnerable. Mary Brennan's sobs intensified. I gave jars to the Hartleys and the Carlsons, and Sarah Parker asked for some just yesterday. Elena was already moving, her actions swift and decisive. Sheriff, I need you to send riders to every ranch and homestead within 20 miles. Anyone who might have received elderberry jam from the Brennan family needs to bring any remaining jam to town immediately. And any family showing symptoms, vomiting, weakness, difficulty breathing, needs to come in now. You want me to create a panic based on your guess about some berries? Elena stopped and fixed Carson with a stare that could have cut glass. Sheriff, in approximately 2 hours, those children are going to start having seizures. Without treatment, they will die before nightfall. And if I'm right about the source of the poisoning, they won't be the only ones. She gestured toward the crowd of townspeople, watching with growing alarm. You can doubt me all you want, but can you afford to be wrong? Carson stared at her for a long moment, then at the unconscious children in the wagon. Finally, he turned to the crowd. Jim Hartley, Ben Miller, Tom Anderson, mount up and ride hard to every homestead in the valley. Anyone who's eaten elderberry jam in the last day needs to get to town now, whether they're showing symptoms or not. As the men scattered to their horses, Elena was already at work. She had Mrs. Parker bring every large pot from the parsonage kitchen, and she set water to boiling over 3 separate fires built in the street. The smell of activated charcoal, one of her most precious medicines, began to fill the air as she prepared the first treatment. What can we do to help? Reverend Parker asked, his face pale but determined. I need every clean cloth in town for washing the poison from their systems, Elena replied, carefully measuring doses of charcoal mixture. And I need space, somewhere we can lay out multiple patients where I can monitor them all. The church, Mrs. Parker suggested. We can move the pews and set up pallets on the floor. Elena nodded gratefully. And I need assistance. People who can follow instructions exactly and won't panic when things get difficult. I can help, Mary Brennan said, wiping her tears. I did this to them. Let me help fix it. Over the next hour, Arcadia transformed into a field hospital. The church filled with pallets and blankets as more families arrived showing symptoms of poisoning. The Miller children came first, 2 boys who had eaten elderberry jam on their morning biscuits and were already showing signs of weakness. Then the Carlson family arrived with their youngest daughter unconscious in the wagon bed. By afternoon, Elena was treating 12 patients ranging in age from 4 to 67. She moved between them like a general commanding a battlefield, directing treatment with calm efficiency even as the crisis deepened. This child needs more charcoal, she called to Mrs. Parker, who had become her most reliable assistant. And the Miller boy, start him on the milk thistle tea. His liver is beginning to struggle with the toxin. What about little Sarah Brennan? Reverend Parker asked. Her breathing's getting worse. Elena hurried to the girl's side and quickly assessed her condition. Sarah was the smallest of the poisoned children, and the toxin was affecting her more severely than the others. Her lips were turning blue despite the respiratory support Elena had been providing. I need fresh air flowing over her face, Elena instructed. And prepare the strongest dose of the antidote tea. She's going to need more aggressive treatment. Antidote tea. Carson had been hovering at the edges of the makeshift hospital, watching Elena work with growing amazement and grudging respect. You have an antidote for pokeweed poisoning? My grandmother developed it after a similar incident in her village many years ago, Elena replied, checking Sarah's pulse. A combination of milk thistle to protect the liver activated willow charcoal to absorb remaining toxin, and a tea made from local plants that help the body eliminate poison. Local plants. Elena looked up from her patient. Sheriff, the antidote grows right here in your valley. Dandelion root for liver support, plantain for digestive healing, red clover for blood purification. The land provides what its people need for healing, if they know how to see it. Carson was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What can I do?" Elena felt a flicker of surprise at the question. This was the first time Carson had offered to help rather than criticized her methods. "I need fresh plantain leaves," she said. "They grow everywhere, in ditches, along fence lines, anywhere the soil is disturbed. The broader the leaves, the better." Carson nodded and headed for the door. "I'll find them." As the afternoon wore on, Elena's treatment began to show results. The Brennan children were the first to respond, their breathing improving as the activated charcoal absorbed the remaining poison in their systems. The Miller boys followed, sitting up and asking for water. One by one, the patients began to stabilize. But not all of them. Old Henrik Carlson, the arthritic rancher whose joints Elena had successfully treated months earlier, was struggling. The pokeweed toxin had hit his aging system hard, and despite Elena's most intensive treatment, his condition continued to deteriorate. "Elena," Mrs. Parker called softly. "I think you need to see Henrik." Elena hurried to the old man's side and immediately saw the problem. Henrik's breathing was becoming erratic, and his pulse was weak and thready. The toxin was affecting his heart rhythm, a complication Elena had feared but hoped to avoid. "Is there anything else you can do?" Carson asked. He had returned with armfuls of plantain, and had been helping to prepare the medicinal teas with surprising competence. Elena felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Henrik Carlson had been one of the first townspeople to accept her treatments, one of the few who had never questioned her methods or motives. If she lost him now, after everything, the fragile trust she had built in Arcadia might shatter completely. "There is one more treatment," she said slowly. "But it is unconventional. Some would call it superstition." Carson looked at her steadily. "Will it help him?" "It might. But I would need to perform a traditional healing ceremony. With singing, and smoke, and—" She hesitated. "Laying on of hands. Prayer in my own language." Elena waited for Carson's reaction, expecting the familiar dismissal, the accusation of witchcraft or pagan ritual. Instead, the sheriff simply nodded. "Do it," he said. "Whatever you think will help him." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected trust in his voice. She quickly gathered the materials she needed: sage for cleansing smoke, copal resin for sacred incense, and a small bundle of herbs specific to heart healing. As she worked, Elena began to sing, softly at first, then with growing confidence. The ancient healing songs her grandmother had taught her filled the church, mixing with the smoke from the sacred herbs. She placed her hands on Henrik's chest and felt for the rhythm of his struggling heart, using her touch to guide the healing energy she had learned to channel long ago. The other patients and their families watched in respectful silence. Even the children, those who were conscious, seemed to understand that something sacred was happening. Carson stood nearby, his expression unreadable but no longer hostile. Gradually, Henrik's breathing began to steady. The erratic flutter of his pulse settled into a stronger, more regular rhythm. Color returned to his weathered face, and his eyes fluttered open. "Elena," he whispered. "What happened?" Elena smiled, her relief overwhelming. "You were very sick, Henrik. But you're going to be fine now." The old rancher looked around at the church full of patients, at the worried faces of his neighbors, at Sheriff Carson standing guard over the makeshift hospital. "Looks like you saved us all," he said quietly. "We saved each other," Elena replied, but her gaze went to Carson as she spoke. As the sun set over Arcadia, the crisis began to truly resolve. The children who had arrived unconscious that morning were sitting up and eating broth. The adults were recovering their strength. The youngest victims, who Elena had feared might suffer permanent damage, showed no signs of lasting effects from the poisoning. Sheriff Carson approached Elena as she finished checking on the last patient. "How did you know?" he asked. "About the pokeweed berries, I mean. How did you identify the poison so quickly?" Elena considered the question. "My grandmother always said that a healer must know both what heals and what harms," she replied. "Pokeweed and elderberry grow near each other in many places. The berries look similar when not fully ripe. It's an easy mistake to make, but a dangerous one." "You saved a dozen lives today," Carson said quietly. "Maybe more." "Today we all saved lives," Elena corrected. "You organized the riders, Mrs. Parker prepared the treatments, Mary Brennan helped despite her grief and guilt. Healing is not the work of one person alone." Carson was quiet for a long moment, watching the families caring for their recovering children. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "Several apologies, actually." "You owe me nothing, Sheriff. I owe you the truth, at least." Carson's voice was rough with emotion he rarely showed. "When you first arrived, all I could see was another stranger who might bring danger to my town. Another source of sickness that could take people away." Elena nodded, understanding. "Mrs. Parker told me about your family. About what you lost." "Cholera took my wife and daughter in 3 days," Carson said, his words barely audible. "I couldn't save them. Couldn't do anything but watch them die. I swore I'd never let that kind of suffering come to another place under my protection. And so you tried to keep all strangers away, in case they brought death with them. It seems foolish now. Cruel." Elena was quiet for a moment, then said, "When Miguel was dying, I would have done anything to save him. If keeping strangers away had been possible, I might have tried that too." She looked at Carson directly. "Fear makes us do things that seem cruel, but come from love." Carson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You came here carrying what I feared most, a sick child, unknown illness, foreign ways I didn't understand. And instead of bringing death, you brought healing." "I brought knowledge," Elena corrected. "The healing came from all of us working together." "Will you stay?" Carson asked suddenly. "In Arcadia, I mean. The town could use a healer. Someone with your knowledge." Elena felt her heart lift with unexpected joy, but she kept her voice steady. "I am not a certified doctor, Sheriff. I have no legal right to practice medicine in the territory." Carson managed a small smile. "I think we can work something out. Maybe create a position for what would you call it? A community health advisor." "I would call it a curandera," Elena replied. "But community health advisor sounds more official." As the families began to gather their recovered children for the journey home, Elena stood in the doorway of the church and looked out over the town that had become, against all odds, her home. Miguel ran up and wrapped his arms around her waist, his face glowing with health and happiness. "Mama, Mrs. Parker says we can stay here forever if we want to. Can we?" Elena looked down at her son, then over at Sheriff Carson, who was helping to load the last of the supplies back into the wagons. The man who had threatened to banish her just that morning was now advocating for her permanent residence. The community that had viewed her with suspicion had rallied around her leadership in their moment of greatest need. "Yes, Mijo," she said, her voice warm with certainty. "I think we can stay here forever." The crisis was over, but Elena understood that something larger had shifted in Arcadia that day. The pokeweed poisoning had forced the community to confront their prejudices and recognize that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. More importantly, it had shown Sheriff Carson that the very differences he feared might actually be the key to his town's salvation. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Elena began planning for tomorrow. There would be follow-up care for the poisoning victims, new medicines to prepare, and lessons to teach about identifying dangerous plants. But for the first time since arriving in Arcadia, she would begin that work not as a reluctant stranger, but as a valued member of the community she had helped to heal. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Elena was checking on Henrik Carlson, who had stayed overnight in the church for observation, when the sound of multiple wagons approached from the south. Through the window, she could see a small convoy making its way up the main street. 3 wagons loaded with supplies and people. More patience? Henrik asked, trying to sit up despite Elena's gentle restraining hand. Rest, Elena instructed. Your heart needs time to fully recover from yesterday's strain. But as the wagons drew closer, Elena realized these weren't desperate families seeking medical help. The lead wagon was driven by a well-dressed man in a black coat, and the others carried what appeared to be medical equipment and supplies. A small knot of concern formed in Elena's stomach. Sheriff Carson appeared in the church doorway, his expression troubled. Elena, there are some men here who want to speak with you. They say they're from the Territorial Medical Board. Elena felt her blood run cold. The Territorial Medical Board had authority to arrest anyone practicing medicine without proper certification. She had always known this day might come, but not now, not when she had finally found a place where her knowledge was valued. What do they want? She asked, though she already knew the answer. To shut you down, Carson replied grimly. Someone sent word south about what happened here yesterday. About you treating patients without a license. Elena's mind raced. Who would have reported her? And why, after she had saved so many lives? The answer came with the arrival of Dr. Marcus Wellesley, a thin, severe-looking man who stepped into the church with the air of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Behind him came 2 territorial marshals and what appeared to be a clerk carrying an official-looking document case. I am Dr. Wellesley, Territorial Medical Examiner, the man announced, his voice carrying throughout the church. I'm here to investigate reports of unlicensed medical practice in this community. Henrik Carlson struggled to sit up fully, his weathered face flushed with indignation. Unlicensed? This woman saved my life yesterday, and the lives of a dozen children. What license does healing require? Dr. Wellesley's gaze swept over the makeshift hospital setup, taking in the herbal preparations, the improvised treatment areas, the obvious signs of Elena's work. His expression grew more disapproving by the moment. Territorial law is quite clear, he said coldly. The practice of medicine requires proper certification from an accredited medical college. Folk remedies and native superstitions may seem harmless to simple frontier folk, but they often delay patients from seeking proper treatment, sometimes with fatal results. Fatal results? Elena found her voice, stepping forward with quiet dignity. Dr. Wellesley, perhaps you could examine my patients and tell me which of them appear to have suffered from my treatment? Wellesley's eyes narrowed. You are the unlicensed practitioner in question? I am Elena Vasquez. I am a curandera, trained in traditional healing methods by my grandmother and her teachers before her. Yesterday I treated 12 cases of pokeweed poisoning using activated charcoal, milk thistle, and supportive herbal therapies. All patients recovered completely. Pokeweed poisoning. Wellesley's tone suggested skepticism. And how exactly did you diagnose this condition without proper medical training or laboratory facilities? Elena met his gaze steadily. The sweet smell characteristic of pokeweed toxin, the rapid onset of symptoms, the gray pallor and respiratory depression consistent with saponin poisoning. The source was confirmed when we traced the contaminated elderberry preserves to their origin. Dr. Wellesley was quiet for a moment, clearly surprised by Elena's medical vocabulary and precise description of symptoms. And your treatment protocol? Immediate gastric lavage with activated charcoal to absorb remaining toxin, milk thistle extract to protect liver function, supportive respiratory care, and monitoring for cardiac complications. Elena's voice remained calm and professional. Standard protocol for plant alkaloid poisoning, as I believe you would find in any current medical textbook. The Territorial Medical Examiner's expression shifted slightly. This was clearly not the folk healer spouting nonsense that he had expected to find. Dr. Wellesley, Sheriff Carson interjected, perhaps you should examine the patients yourself before making any judgments about the quality of care they received. Over the next hour, Dr. Wellesley conducted a thorough examination of each recovered patient. Elena watched nervously as he checked pupils, listened to heartbeats, tested reflexes, and questioned family members about symptoms and recovery timeline. His expression grew increasingly perplexed as patient after patient showed no signs of ill effects from their ordeal. Finally, Wellesley approached Elena with a mixture of curiosity and grudging respect. "Your treatment was surprisingly sophisticated," he admitted. "Where did you receive your medical training?" "From my grandmother, as I told you, and from treating similar cases over many years." "Your grandmother was a physician?" Elena chose her words carefully. "My grandmother was the most skilled healer in our valley. She learned from curanderas whose knowledge stretches back generations, to a time when all healing was done with plants and prayer and careful observation of the human body." Dr. Wellesley was quiet for a long moment. "Miss Vasquez, I came here prepared to arrest a dangerous charlatan who is endangering frontier families with primitive superstitions. Instead, I find someone whose practical knowledge of toxicology and emergency medicine appears to exceed that of many licensed physicians I know." Elena felt a flutter of hope, but kept her expression neutral. "Knowledge is knowledge, Dr. Wellesley, regardless of where it comes from." "Indeed." The territorial examiner looked around the church, taking in the evidence of Elena's successful treatment. "However, territorial law remains clear. The practice of medicine requires proper certification." Elena's heart sank, but Dr. Wellesley continued, "Fortunately, there are provisions for exceptional circumstances. Given the remote location of this community, the absence of licensed medical care, and the demonstrable effectiveness of your treatment methods, I am prepared to recommend that you be granted provisional medical authority under Territorial Statute 847. "What does that mean?" Carson asked. "It means," Dr. Wellesley explained, "that Miss Vasquez would be authorized to continue providing medical care to this community while working toward formal certification. She would need to document her treatments, report regularly to the Territorial Medical Board, and eventually complete examinations to validate her knowledge against current medical standards." Elena could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You would allow me to continue healing?" "My dear woman," Dr. Wellesley said with something approaching warmth, "you saved 12 lives yesterday using sound medical principles and innovative treatment methods. The Territorial Medical Board exists to protect citizens from dangerous quackery, not to prevent effective healing." He smiled slightly. "Besides, I suspect you could teach many of our certified physicians a thing or two about practical medicine." The transformation in the church was immediate. Henrik Carlson actually cheered from his sickbed. The Parker family beamed with obvious relief and pride. Even the territorial marshals seemed pleased with the resolution. But it was Sheriff Carson's reaction that meant the most to Elena. The man who had spent months questioning her every action now stepped forward with unmistakable pride in his voice. "Dr. Wellesley," he said, "Arcadia would be honored to have Elena Vasquez as our official community physician. She's proven herself to be exactly what this town needs." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at Carson's words. The title community physician carried weight and respect that curandera never would in the Anglo world, but she knew that both were simply different names for the same calling, the sacred work of healing. As Dr. Wellesley and his party prepared to leave, he approached Elena one final time. "Miss Vasquez, I'll be sending you some medical texts and journals that might interest you. Modern medicine has much to learn from traditional healing methods, and I suspect the combination of your inherited knowledge with current medical advances could be quite powerful." Elena nodded gratefully. "I would welcome such learning, Dr. Wellesley. A healer should never stop growing in knowledge." That evening, as the excitement of the day finally settled, Elena found herself alone in the church with Sheriff Carson. He was helping her reorganize the medical supplies that had been scattered during the emergency treatment the day before. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly, carefully arranging bottles of herbal tinctures on a makeshift shelf. "I owe you an explanation of why I fought against accepting your help for so long." "You already explained about your family. That's part of it, but not all." Carson straightened, meeting her eyes directly. "The truth is, Elena, you scared me. Not because you were foreign or different, but because you were so obviously skilled at something I desperately needed and couldn't provide. Elena waited for him to continue, sensing that this confession was costing him considerable effort. When cholera took my wife and daughter, I was completely helpless, Carson continued. I couldn't save them, couldn't even ease their suffering. I became a sheriff partly to have some control, some way to protect people from danger. But medical emergencies, those always reminded me of my complete powerlessness. And then I arrived with healing knowledge you didn't possess. Exactly. Every life you saved was a reminder that I had failed to save the lives that mattered most to me. Carson's voice was barely audible. It was easier to convince myself that your methods were dangerous superstition than to admit that you could do what I couldn't. Elena felt a deep wave of compassion for this man who had carried such burden of guilt and inadequacy for so long. Thomas, she said, using his first name for the first time, what happened to your family was not your failure. Cholera is a terrible disease that defeats even trained doctors with all their modern medicines. You cannot heal what you were never taught to heal. But you could have healed them, couldn't you? Carson asked, his eyes bright with unshed tears. If you had been there, with your grandmother's knowledge and your understanding of plant medicines. Elena considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would either provide healing or deepen his wounds. Perhaps, she said finally. Or perhaps not. Healing is not magic, Thomas. It is knowledge and skill and sometimes luck, but it is not magic. Even the most skilled curandera cannot save every patient, cannot prevent every death. Carson nodded slowly, and Elena could see some of the weight he had carried for 15 years beginning to lift from his shoulders. What I can tell you, Elena continued, is that your wife and daughter knew they were loved, and sometimes, that is the most important healing of all. As the last light faded from the western sky, Elena began planning for tomorrow. There would be follow-up care for the poisoning victims, new medicines to prepare, and lessons to teach about identifying dangerous plants. There would be medical texts to study and reports to write for the territorial board. But for the first time since arriving in Arcadia, she would begin that work not as a reluctant stranger, but as a valued and officially recognized member of the community she had helped to heal. October painted the hills around Arcadia in shades of gold and crimson, the aspens trembling in the crisp morning air as Elena made her way to the newly constructed clinic. What had begun as a temporary arrangement in the church parsonage had grown into something neither she nor the townspeople had originally envisioned, a permanent medical facility serving not just Arcadia, but the entire surrounding valley. The building itself was modest but purposeful, a single large room with good light from south-facing windows, shelves lined with both traditional herbs and modern medical supplies, and a smaller back room for preparing medicines and conducting private examinations. Most importantly, it had been built by the community itself, each family contributing labor, materials, or funds according to their means. Elena paused at the door to read the painted sign that Sheriff Carson had commissioned from a traveling artist. Arcadia Community Clinic, Elena Vasquez, licensed medical practitioner. The word licensed still filled her with wonder. After months of study, correspondence with Dr. Wellesley, and a grueling 3-day examination in Santa Fe, the Territorial Medical Board had granted her full certification, the first curandera in New Mexico Territory to achieve such recognition. "Morning, Doc Elena," called Jim Hartley from the trading post across the street. The title had evolved naturally over the summer months, and Elena had grown comfortable with it. In her heart, she remained a curandera, but to the territorial authorities and the growing stream of patients from distant communities, she was Dr. Elena Vasquez. "Good morning, Jim," Elena replied, unlocking the clinic door. "How is Sarah feeling today?" "Much better, thanks to that tea you prepared. Baby's moving more now, and Sarah says the nausea is finally passing." Elena smiled as she stepped inside. Sarah Hartley's difficult pregnancy had been one of many cases that had cemented Elena's reputation throughout the territory. Word had spread of the Mexican woman whose unconventional treatments succeeded where conventional medicine had failed, drawing patients from as far away as Colorado and Texas. The morning's first appointment was with young Tommy Brennan, the boy whose pokeweed poisoning 5 months earlier had triggered the crisis that transformed Elena's relationship with Arcadia. His mother Mary brought him in for a routine check of his development, but Elena suspected there was more behind the visit. "Tommy looks strong and healthy," Elena observed, finishing her examination of the 8-year-old boy. "His growth is normal, his reflexes are excellent, and I see no lingering effects from his poisoning." "Thank God for that," Mary said, but her expression remained troubled. "Doc Elena, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offense." Elena sat back in her chair, giving Mary her full attention. "Please, speak freely." "It's about Sheriff Carson. People are talking, well, they're saying that you and he—" Mary's cheeks reddened with embarrassment. "That is, some folks have noticed that he's been spending considerable time at the clinic, helping with patients and such." Elena felt her own face warm. The gossip was not entirely wrong. Over the past months, Thomas Carson had become not just an ally but a true partner in her work. He had learned to assist with medical procedures, had proven remarkably adept at comforting frightened children during treatment, and had become her most trusted advisor on the complex dynamics of frontier community life. More than that, Elena had begun to recognize feelings developing between them that went far beyond professional cooperation. She saw it in the way Thomas looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in his protective instincts when difficult patients challenged her authority, in the gentle way he helped her prepare medicines after long days of treating the sick. "Sheriff Carson has been very supportive of the clinic's work," Elena said carefully. "His help has been invaluable." Mary smiled knowingly. "Elena, you're a good woman and a fine doctor, but you're a terrible liar. Half the town can see that Thomas Carson is smitten with you, and the other half can see that you feel the same way about him." Before Elena could respond, the clinic door opened and Thomas himself appeared, carrying a wooden crate of supplies from the latest freight wagon. His face lit up when he saw Elena, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with medicine. "Morning, Mary Tommy," Thomas said, setting down the crate. "Elena, those medical journals you ordered from Boston finally arrived." Dr. Wellesley included a note saying the article about plant-based cardiac treatments was inspired by your work with Henrik Carlson. Elena felt a surge of pride. Her success in treating Henrik's heart complications using traditional methods had caught the attention of medical professionals across the country, leading to several requests for her to document her techniques for publication in medical journals. "Wonderful," Elena said. "I'm eager to see what new developments are being explored." Thomas lingered as Mary gathered Tommy for their departure, clearly wanting to speak privately with Elena. After the Brennans left, he approached with an expression Elena had learned to recognize, the look he wore when struggling with something important. "Elena, there's something I need to discuss with you," he began, then paused as the clinic door opened again. This time it was Dr. Marcus Wellesley himself, arriving unannounced in a dust-covered buggy. Elena felt a moment of concern. The territorial medical examiner's surprise visits usually meant trouble of some kind. "Dr. Wellesley," Elena said, rising to greet him. "This is unexpected. I hope there are no problems with my certification status." "Quite the opposite," Wellesley replied, his usually stern face brightening with something approaching enthusiasm. "Elena, may I call you Elena? I've come with a proposition that I believe will interest you greatly." Thomas moved closer, his protective instincts clearly engaged. "What kind of proposition?" Wellesley looked between them, noting Thomas's defensive posture and Elena's calm but alert expression. "The territorial governor has been reviewing reports of medical innovation and community health improvements across New Mexico. Your work here in Arcadia, Elena, has attracted considerable attention at the highest levels of territorial administration." Elena felt a flutter of nervousness. Political attention was not always welcome for someone in her position. "I'm not sure I understand, Dr. Wellesley." "The governor is establishing a new position, Director of Traditional Medicine Integration for New Mexico Territory. The role would involve traveling to communities throughout the territory, training local healers in both traditional and modern medical techniques, and developing protocols for incorporating indigenous healing knowledge into territorial healthcare policy." Elena stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You're asking me to leave Arcadia?" "I'm asking you to expand your influence beyond Arcadia," Wellesley clarified. "The position would be based here, in the community where you've had such success, but would involve extensive travel and the establishment of training programs throughout the territory." Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "And if Elena isn't interested in leaving the community that needs her?" Wellesley smiled at the obvious protectiveness in Thomas's voice. "Sheriff Carson, the position would require significant administrative support. Someone familiar with frontier law enforcement, community organization, and territorial politics. The governor specifically requested recommendations for a deputy administrator who could handle the legal and logistical aspects of the program." Elena felt her heart race as she understood the implications. "You're offering positions to both of us?" "I'm offering you the chance to transform territorial healthcare policy while remaining based in the community you've built here," Wellesley confirmed. "And Sheriff Carson, I'm offering you the opportunity to protect and serve not just one community, but to help extend life-saving medical knowledge throughout New Mexico territory." Elena looked at Thomas, seeing her own excitement and uncertainty reflected in his face. The offer was extraordinary, a chance to legitimize and spread traditional healing knowledge on a scale she had never imagined possible. But it would also mean leaving the quiet life they had built in Arcadia, the sense of belonging she had found here. "How long do we have to consider this?" Thomas asked. "The governor would like an answer by the end of November," Wellesley replied. "The program would begin in January, if you decide to accept." After Wellesley left, Elena and Thomas stood in the clinic's main room, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of the opportunity they'd been offered. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "Elena, before we discuss the governor's proposal, there's something else I need to say. Something I should have said months ago." Elena turned to face him fully, seeing vulnerability in his expression that reminded her of the night when he'd finally shared the story of his lost family. "I love you," Thomas said simply. "I've been trying to work up the courage to tell you for weeks, but I kept finding excuses to wait. The territorial examiner's visits, your certification process, the expansion of the clinic." He smiled ruefully. "Truth is, I've been afraid that someone as remarkable as you couldn't possibly feel the same way about a small-town sheriff with more past failures than future prospects." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas Carson," she said, stepping closer to him, "you are the bravest, kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. You transformed yourself from my greatest opponent into my strongest supporter. You learned to see past your fears and prejudices to recognize truth and value where you hadn't expected to find them." She reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Of course I love you. How could I not?" Thomas pulled her into his arms, and for a long moment they simply held each other in the afternoon light streaming through the clinic windows. Elena breathed in his familiar scent, soap and leather and the faint smell of the metal polish he used on his badge, and marveled at how completely her life had changed since that desperate morning when she'd climbed down from a freight wagon with a dying child in her arms. "So," Thomas said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "what do we do about the governor's offer?" Elena considered the question seriously. "What do you think we should do?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that your grandmother's wisdom deserves to reach every corner of this territory. I think there are communities out there struggling with sickness and injury who could benefit from what you know, just like Arcadia did." He paused, then continued, "But I also think we need to be sure we're making this decision together, as partners in everything." Elena smiled at the word, partners. It encompassed so much more than romance. It spoke to the professional collaboration they had built, the shared commitment to healing and protecting their community, the mutual respect that had grown from their initial antagonism. "Partners," she repeated, liking the sound of it. "Thomas, would you be willing to travel throughout the territory, helping to establish medical programs in remote communities? It would mean leaving Arcadia for months at a time, facing resistance from people who don't understand our methods. Would you be willing to take on the responsibility of changing territorial medical policy, knowing that every decision you make could affect thousands of lives?" Thomas countered. Elena laughed. When you put it that way, it sounds terrifying. It sounds like the most important work we could possibly do. They were interrupted by a commotion from the street. Children's voices raised in excitement, the sound of approaching horses, and underneath it all, a sound that made Elena's blood run cold, the desperate crying of someone in pain. Elena and Thomas rushed outside to see a familiar sight, a wagon racing into town at dangerous speed, its driver lashing the horses while passengers in the wagon bed called for help. But this time, Elena felt no fear at the approaching crisis. She had everything she needed to respond: knowledge, supplies, community support, and a partner who would stand beside her through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Dr. Elena," called the wagon driver as he pulled up in front of the clinic. "Thank God you're here. We've got 2 men hurt bad in a mining accident up at Copper Creek. Cave entrapped them for hours before we could dig them out." Elena was already moving, her healer's instincts taking control. "Thomas, help me get them into the clinic. I'll need you to assist with the surgery." "Surgery?" Thomas asked, but he was already helping to lift the first injured miner from the wagon. "Crushed leg bones, from the look of it, and possible internal injuries." Elena examined the second patient quickly. "This one has a punctured lung. See how his breathing is labored and that bluish tinge to his lips? We'll need to relieve the pressure in his chest cavity." As they carried the injured men into the clinic, Elena felt the familiar clarity that came with medical emergencies. Her mind automatically sorted through treatment options, prioritized interventions, calculated doses of pain medication. But now there was an additional element: complete confidence in her partner's ability to support her work. "What do you need me to do?" Thomas asked. Already washing his hands at the basin, Elena kept prepared for such emergencies. "Help me stabilize the chest injury first. The lung collapse is more immediately life-threatening than the broken bones." Elena was already pulling supplies from her carefully organized shelves. "Then we'll need to set the leg fractures and check for internal bleeding." Word of the mining accident spread quickly through Arcadia, and soon the clinic was surrounded by concerned townspeople offering assistance. Mrs. Parker arrived with clean linens and hot water. Jim Hartley brought lanterns to improve the lighting. Dr. Henrik Carlson, despite his age, appeared with an offer to help however he could. Elena worked steadily for 3 hours, using a combination of traditional techniques and modern surgical procedures to repair the damage caused by tons of falling rock. Thomas proved to be an excellent surgical assistant, anticipating her needs and providing steady, capable support throughout the delicate procedures. As the sun set over Arcadia, both miners were resting comfortably in the clinic's recovery area. The lung collapse had been successfully treated, and both sets of leg fractures had been set with good alignment. More importantly, both men were conscious and talking, a sign that there were no serious head injuries or internal bleeding. "Will they recover fully?" asked Bill Murphy, the mine foreman who had brought them to town. Elena considered the question carefully. The chest injury was serious, but if we can prevent infection, he should heal completely. The leg fractures are more complicated. It will be months before he can walk normally again, and he may always have some stiffness. But yes, I believe both men will recover. Bill Murphy's relief was palpable. "Doc Elena, I don't know how to thank you. If we'd had to take them all the way to Santa Fe, they wouldn't have survived the journey," Elena finished quietly. "The lung collapse would have been fatal within hours." As the townspeople gradually dispersed, Elena and Thomas found themselves alone in the clinic with their sleeping patients. Elena slumped in her chair, suddenly exhausted from the intensity of the surgical procedures and the emotional weight of holding 2 lives in her hands. "That was incredible," Thomas said, settling into the chair beside her. "Elena, what you did today. I've never seen anything like it." Elena looked at her hands, still steady despite the long hours of delicate work. "Today was why I became a healer, Thomas. Those moments when knowledge and skill and determination come together to pull someone back from the edge of death. And today was why I want to accept the governor's offer," Thomas replied. "How many communities in this territory don't have access to someone with your knowledge? How many people die from injuries that you could treat, simply because they're too far from help. Elena nodded slowly. My grandmother always said that knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. If I can train even one healer in each community we visit, that could save dozens of lives over the years. Then we're decided. Elena looked around the clinic, at the shelves of medicines she had organized, at the examination table where she had saved so many lives, at the window that looked out over the community that had become her home. Then she looked at Thomas, this man who had transformed from her greatest obstacle into her strongest support, and saw her own determination reflected in his eyes. We're decided, she confirmed. We'll accept the governor's offer. But Thomas. Yes. I want to be married before we begin this new work. I want to face whatever challenges come as your wife, not just your professional partner. Thomas's face lit up with joy. Elena Vasquez, are you proposing to me? Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. I suppose I am. Will you marry me, Thomas Carson? Yes, Thomas said, pulling her into his arms. Yes, absolutely yes. As they kissed in the lamplight of the clinic they had built together, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had arrived in Arcadia as a desperate mother with a dying child, carrying nothing but her grandmother's knowledge and a determination to save the son she loved. Now she was leaving as a certified physician with a mission to transform territorial healthcare, carrying not only her inherited wisdom but also the love of a man who had learned to see past differences to recognize the truth of who she really was. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, dusting the streets of Arcadia with white. But inside the clinic, surrounded by the tools of healing and the warmth of love freely given and received, Elena felt only the promise of spring, the eternal possibility of new growth, new beginnings, and new chances to make the world a little better than it had been before. The clinic would remain open while they traveled, staffed by trained assistants and visited regularly by other territorial physicians. The community they had helped to heal would continue to thrive. And somewhere in distant valleys and remote settlements, other desperate mothers with sick children would find the help they needed, because two people had learned that the greatest healing comes not from medicine alone, but from the courage to build bridges across the differences that divide us. Elena Vasquez Carson, for she would keep both names, honoring both her heritage and her new life, would spend the rest of her career teaching that wisdom to anyone willing to learn. And Thomas Carson would spend his protecting and supporting her as she did, knowing that sometimes the best way to serve your own community is to help heal the wider world of which it is a part. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors, word of the successful surgery having spread throughout the valley overnight. Ranchers and miners, mothers with worried questions about their children's health, elderly folks seeking relief from the aches of frontier life, all came seeking the counsel of the woman who had become their trusted healer. Among them was an unexpected face, Mary Brennan, but this time accompanied by her entire family, including her husband Robert, whom Elena had rarely seen in town. Dr. Elena, Robert Brennan said, removing his hat with obvious respect. Mary told me what you and Sheriff Carson have been offered by the territorial governor. I wanted to speak with you before you make your final decision. Elena invited the Brennan family into the clinic's consultation area, curious about what had prompted this formal visit. Robert Brennan was known throughout the valley as a man of few words who rarely involved himself in town affairs. Dr. Elena, Robert continued, I need to tell you something that I've never told another soul outside my family. Before we came to New Mexico, we lived in Kansas. Lost our first 2 children to a diphtheria outbreak. They died because the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away, and by the time we got them there, it was too late. Mary took her husband's hand, her eyes bright with tears at the painful memory. That's why we moved here, Robert continued. Trying to get away from the memory of helplessness, of watching our babies die because we couldn't get them proper care. He looked directly at Elena. When you saved our children from the pokeweed poisoning, you didn't just save their lives. You saved us from having to live through that nightmare again. Elena felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. Robert, I'm honored by your trust in sharing this with me. The thing is, Robert said, there are families all over this territory living with the same fear we lived with. Parents who lie awake at night wondering what they'll do if their children get sick, if their wife has complications in childbirth, if an accident happens and there's no one to help? He paused, gathering his thoughts. What the governor is offering you, the chance to train healers throughout the territory, that could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of families. Elena nodded slowly. I understand the importance of the work, Robert. But it would mean leaving Arcadia for months at a time, leaving the community that has become my home. Mary spoke up for the first time. Elena, Arcadia will always be your home. But your knowledge, your gift, it belongs to more than just us. We've been selfish, wanting to keep you here where we feel safe and cared for. But there are children out there, in isolated ranches and mining camps, who need what you know. Thomas appeared in the clinic doorway, having overheard the conversation. Robert, Mary, I appreciate what you're saying. But we haven't made our decision lightly. Taking on the territorial position would mean enormous responsibility and considerable risk. Sheriff, Robert replied, with respect, staying here would be the real risk. The risk of letting your talents serve only a few dozen families when they could serve thousands. He gestured toward his children, who were playing quietly in the corner of the clinic. My kids have a future because Elena was here when we needed her. Don't other children deserve that same chance? After the Brennan family left, Elena and Thomas spent the morning discussing the weight of the choice before them. The territorial position would mean regular travel to remote communities, establishing training programs for local healers, navigating complex political situations, and taking responsibility for medical policies that could affect the entire territory. Thomas, Elena said as they prepared lunch in the small kitchen behind the clinic, are we being foolish to consider leaving this life we've built here? Thomas was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot of stew Elena had started earlier. I've been thinking about that question for days, he said finally. And I keep coming back to something my father told me when I was young. He said that the purpose of building something good isn't to hoard it for yourself, but to use it as a foundation for building something even better. Elena looked around the clinic, at the shelves of medicines, the examination table, the comfortable chairs where worried families waited for news of their loved ones. This place has been our foundation, hasn't it? The best foundation we could have asked for. We learned to trust each other here, learned to work together, learned that healing comes not just from medicine but from community and love. Thomas smiled. Now we have the chance to help other communities build the same kind of foundation. That afternoon brought another test of their skills and partnership. A young woman named Catherine Mills arrived at the clinic in obvious distress, supported by her anxious husband David. Catherine was in the early stages of labor with their first child, but something was clearly wrong. The pains started this morning, David explained, his face pale with worry. But they're different from what the other women told us to expect. Sharper, and they're coming too close together. Elena quickly examined Catherine and felt her heart sink. The baby was in breech position, and Catherine's relatively small frame made the delivery potentially dangerous for both mother and child. Thomas, Elena said quietly, I'll need you to assist me with this. It's going to be a difficult delivery. Over the next 6 hours, Elena worked with patient skill to safely deliver the breech baby, using techniques her grandmother had taught her combined with modern positioning methods she had learned from her medical texts. Thomas proved invaluable, providing both physical support for the exhausting process and emotional reassurance for the frightened parents. When baby James Mills finally arrived, healthy and crying lustily, Elena felt the familiar surge of joy that came with bringing new life safely into the world. But she also felt something else, a deep sense of responsibility for ensuring that other women in remote areas would have access to the same skilled care when their time came. Catherine, Elena said as she cleaned the newborn, you and the baby are going to be fine. But this was a complicated delivery that could have been dangerous without proper assistance. Catherine, exhausted but radiant with joy, nodded gratefully. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here, Dr. Elena. That's exactly what I've been thinking, Elena replied, glancing at Thomas. What happens to women in isolated areas who face the same complications? Who helps them when there's no trained midwife or doctor available? That evening, as they cleaned and organized the clinic after the successful delivery, Elena and Thomas found themselves returning to the conversation about the territorial position. "Today settled it for me," Elena said, carefully replacing medical instruments in their proper places. "Catherine and baby James are safe because we were here, because we had the knowledge and supplies needed for a complicated delivery. But there are women all over this territory who face the same risks without any trained help available." Thomas nodded. "And there are mining accidents like today's, and poisoning cases like the Brennan children, and 100 other medical emergencies happening in places where people have no choice but to hope for the best." "The governor's program could change that," Elena continued. "Not immediately, not everywhere, but community by community. We could establish training programs and supply networks that would give people access to basic medical care." "It won't be easy," Thomas warned. "We'll face the same resistance in other communities that we faced here initially. People suspicious of foreign methods, authorities worried about unlicensed practice, communities set in their ways." Elena smiled. "Thomas, we turned you from my greatest opponent into my strongest supporter. If we can accomplish that transformation, we can handle whatever resistance we encounter elsewhere." "When you put it that way," Thomas replied, pulling her into his arms, "it almost sounds like we don't have a choice. Like this is what we're meant to do." "I think it is," Elena agreed. "I think my grandmother's wisdom brought me here not just to heal this community, but to learn how to heal the larger community of which it's a part." The next morning, Elena composed a letter to Dr. Wellesley, formally accepting the territorial positions for both herself and Thomas. As she wrote, she felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation about the challenges ahead, but also a deep sense of rightness about the choice they had made. They would be married in December, in the church where Elena had first proved her healing skills during the pokeweed crisis. The entire community would celebrate with them, and then in January, they would begin their new work as partners in both life and the mission to bring healing knowledge to every corner of New Mexico territory. In the spring, they would begin their new work together. But tonight, they simply held each other in the clinic they had built, surrounded by the tools of healing and the promise of all the lives they would save in the years to come. Outside, the first snow of winter continued to fall, but inside, they were already planning for the spring that would bring new challenges, new communities to serve, and new opportunities to prove that healing, real, lasting healing, comes not from medicine alone, but from the courage to build bridges across the differences that divide us.